So we're going to be continuing our Q&A on relationships. Don't actually have that many more questions left. So I guess that's not an invitation to receive more. I think we're getting to a place where a number of people are asking to change subjects. So again, I guess if people can give me some feedback at the end, what they want. So let's begin. What advice can I give for getting to know someone without getting carried away or letting our feelings become so overwhelming that we cannot form platonic friendships with someone we are interested in? So this is probably a question that's asked more frequently or more often than people may appreciate. I'll restate the question. What advice can I give for getting to know someone without getting carried away or letting our feelings become so overwhelming that we cannot form platonic friendships with someone we are interested in? So let me try to state it this way. I think the notion that you can enter into this benign, or the person's called it a platonic friendship with someone, and not have these feelings that are being spoken of, I think it's an impossibility, really. I'm not even sure why people not only think it's not possible, but I'm not even sure why people think it's actually wrong to have feelings about someone at a very early stage in someone's relationship, a friendship. If you're attracted to somebody, I don't think you can deny those feelings of attraction and pretend that they don't exist. Now, you can pretend to the person, and you can certainly pretend to the outside world, but I don't think you can actually pretend to yourself. And I guess the question, as far as I understand it, is not connected to letting your feelings show to other people, but it's about actually having those feelings yourself and whether or not they're wrong. So my understanding is that it's completely natural to have those feelings, and trying to pretend that they don't exist or to squash them, I think is an endeavour that's doomed to failure. The person asks about these feelings become so overwhelming. I think there is a place to control emotions and feelings, but to pretend that they don't exist, I think is living in a pretend world, in trying to have a false experience about what human nature really is. I think I don't want to prejudge, I don't even know who the questioner is, but I think questions like this come from a conservative mindset, that we actually think it's wrong to be attracted to people, we think it's wrong to have strong emotions about people without entering into some kind of relationship with them. And I'm inclined to view things completely the other way round. That I think these feelings of affection, of warmth, people would call it love, passion, I think these are not only inherent in human nature, I think they are not only positive but they're necessary. I think they're part of human nature that we can't just switch on or switch off. So I don't feel as threatened as the questioner does about this issue of having strong feelings about someone. I think it's this idea that there's some kind of sin to being an emotional machine that leads us to think that in a what people would call a platonic relationship, to actually, if I can use a colloquial term that we use here in the UK, that you fancy someone is inherently wrong, and I think it's inherently normal. What we do with those feelings of passion, lust, etc., that is another question, and I do believe that all of us, and I don't just mean us Christians, all human beings need to control their emotions. Obviously, one's religious and cultural background will determine to what level or what degree we temper those feelings or emotions. But I think it's wrong for us to pretend that they don't exist or to deny them. So we can talk about these platonic relationships. I understand that. But in a relationship between two human beings, if there was you or me and you have a range of friends, 6 people, some you will not be physically attracted to, but your friendship can be deep and enduring, and others you will find physically attractive. Now, just because you find someone physically attractive, it doesn't mean you have strong, overwhelming feelings about them. You can just find people physically attractive. But in that group of friends, there may be one that you really do like. And the questioner presupposes that it's wrong to have those feelings. And I guess I'm presupposing that it's not only normal and acceptable, but I think it's right and proper that we do have those feelings, because in that, Adventists will say 1 in 100, but in the example I gave 1 in 10, in that friendship that you have with that one person, you actually have the opportunity of developing a relationship that will not only blossom but endure, and if you're lucky, become a relationship that eventually becomes marriage. So I'm going to repeat the question again. What advice can I give for getting to know someone without getting carried away or letting our feelings become so overwhelming that we can't form platonic friendships with someone we are interested in? I think we can actually form platonic friendships with people. I think if you're married with your spouse, you should have a platonic relationship. Every time you look at your husband or your wife, you don't have deep sexual thoughts about them. Your feelings change throughout the day, throughout the week, depending upon your circumstances. So I think it's a falsity to think when you're passionately in love with someone, all you ever dream about them is, some kind of illicit, intimate sexual thoughts. The range of thoughts that we go through with people that we have deep affection for changes through the day, through the week. So I think we can form good, solid friendships with people that we are physically attracted to. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. What we do with those feelings, obviously, is a different discussion. But the fact that we have them, I don't think is necessarily wrong. I think it's a pretense to pretend that they don't exist. Now, what I think actually will happen with most people is either that strong feeling will subside and will essentially fade away, and you'll just get to know them, and that passion that you have for them will subside after some time. There are others that it doesn't subside with. It endures, it may even strengthen. And I think in those situations, you have something that people call different names. I'm just going to call it chemistry or electricity. There is some magnetic attraction between the two of you, and those feelings don't just subside. They continue to grow and develop and strengthen. And I think that's how relationships should be built. Not that you meet a stranger or you go on a dating agency and you hook up with someone and they become your boyfriend or girlfriend. And I mean that in the Adventist way. We will call it courtship normally. I don't advocate, and people who know me know I don't advocate going from nothing to courtship. I think it's a bad move. I think people who do that get themselves into a lot of trouble. And I think the reason why we see more trouble today than we had in the past is because our expectations of our relationships with our spouse are much greater today than they were in bygone ages. And the reason why our expectations or our demands upon our partner are so much higher today than they were in the past is simple. And I think it's this, that the relationships that we should have outside of that intimacy, that one-on-one that you have with your partner. I'm just thinking of your siblings, your parents, your uncles, aunts, cousins. For many of us don't exist. We don't have strong ties to close or even extended family as people would in bygone ages. We live on, in a community where we don't even know our neighbours. This is not just a function of country living or city living. Most people have no idea who their neighbours are. They don't wander in and out of their homes. They're not deep friends. They don't know what's going on in other people's lives. And all that erosion of, I want to call it intimacy, with those who should be in our lives has for many people evaporated. And therefore those needs need to be met. Even if you're not conscious of it, they need to be met, period. And they end up will have to be met by your spouse. So I think that's an important thing to remember when we're having this discussion. So just in summary then, when we talk about platonic relationships, I think people have a very rigid and very strict definition of what that means. It infers that there's no physical attraction that you can have. And I guess I don't think that's true. I certainly don't think it's realistic. And I think for people, like us who are together, I think if we try to have that position, I think we're actually not being true to ourselves. I don't think it's reality that people live in this world that they don't find good friends physically attractive. I'm not saying we should act upon those attractions. I think in the vast majority of cases, if you're sensible and behave properly, you can manage those emotions and they don't interrupt or damage your friendship. I think you can have a perfectly healthy friendship with someone even if you find them physically attractive. If it wasn't the case, then all your friends should be ugly, however you define ugly for yourself. And I think most of us just know that doesn't make any sense. And the reason why I think this is important, because I actually think this is the mechanism or one of the stepping stones in actually forming a proper relationship in marriage. I think, to me, this is the way that you can develop a good relationship in your marriage, by starting off in these steps. The next question. So someone asked, obviously we don't just have friends in this movement, we have friends outside of the movement. And what do we do when we get into those situations? So if you're in that situation and you're not able to manage those feelings, because I don't think you can just, people talk about suppressing those feelings. I'm not sure if that's even possible to do. You can manage them, I don't know about suppressing them. If you find things getting out of control in a friendship that you know could never lead anywhere, which would be an illegitimate relationship, the Bible might call it fornication. Perhaps we would feel uncomfortable using such strong words. But if you find yourself in that situation, I think what you would have to do is begin to temper that relationship that you have with that person. If you see in your own thinking that, if I put it this way, it's getting out of hand, that you're not able to manage your relationships, your relationship with that person who's not in the movement, I think you'd have to be cautious about how you interact with that person so that you don't get yourself into trouble. So someone says all your friends should be ugly if you can't control yourself. I guess that's one way of looking at it. I said that kind of tongue-in-cheek, facetiously. Next question. Is it acceptable and still valid in the eyes of God to get married without a religious ceremony? So basically, it's a question again that comes up reasonably often nowadays. Is someone wants to be married? Can they marry with just a state ceremony? Do they have to have what we would call a Christian wedding or a religious ceremony? Does God need to bless their wedding? You can express the question in different ways, but it always leads to that same point. So I'll ask the question again. Is it acceptable and still valid in the eyes of God to get married without a religious ceremony? So I'm going to give the simple answer as far as I view it, and say no, it's not acceptable. Now, I'm not God and I don't have his eyes, so I don't really know, what he thinks in any particular circumstance or any particular relationship. But I think in broad principles, it wouldn't be acceptable, no. In the same way, it wouldn't be acceptable to be baptized by the state, to we'll just stick with baptism. If you wanted to go to communion, you could. Think of any of those ordinances, which are all meant to be symbols of a relationship that we have with God, or our entrance into the kingdom of heaven, depending on how one views those models. You can view them different ways. So if we if we were to think of these ordinances in that perspective, then you wouldn't go to the stake to get baptized. So I've never been asked that question: is it acceptable now to get baptized by an atheist, or as a state representative? Never been asked, can we do communion and just bring say a Catholic priest to do that work? Would it have to be someone in the movement? Don't get asked those questions, but when it comes to marriage, I get asked that question a fair bit nowadays. And the question is, why are people asking that question? What has changed in people's thinking about the concept and their view of marriage? So I want to suggest that, like all the relationships that we have been given in this world with other human beings, they are all parables. They're all meant to represent our relationship with God in some shape or form. As I said, these ordinances, and I've just mentioned marriage, particularly baptism and communion, are all representative of some kind of form of entrance into the kingdom of heaven, but they can also be understood to be some kind of commitment between ourselves and God. Our relationship with Him can be viewed in both ways, depending on one's point of view. So what is marriage? Why have we been given marriage? What is it supposed to represent or symbolize? I think we all know the answer to that, and I really want to just view this in a very simplistic way. Marriage is a symbol of the union of a human being with God. And just in the same way we could view baptism as the death of self and the resurrection of a selfless life that is committing to serve God. Communion is, again, the rejection of an old life. In fact, it's a recommitment of the rejection of that old life, that you are now partaking of God's body and blood, and from that ordinance you walk away renewed. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, blood of my blood. There's this oneness, and marriage is supposed to represent that same union, the oneness between a human and God. And therefore, if that's what it's meant to represent, how could the state enact that? I think it's the same question that you would ask, that can the state perform baptisms? And I think most of us would recognize that that just cannot happen. You could argue, if you want to be consistently logical, that the state could do everything for us then. In that case, you could get your local politician and he could do the sermon for you. Or you could get a local atheist who was a highly moral person and they could do the church service. We obviously know all of those things become ludicrous. And so in the same way, I think the whole ethos, the whole purpose of marriage is a religious ceremony. It's a religious enactment of a human becoming one flesh with God. And if that's what marriage is supposed to represent, then how could we perform that ceremony without involving Him? Now, this leads on to another question, or it's probably a side point. We all know, if you went to Romans 6 particularly, Paul describes what baptism is like, how it functions. So I know people are really excited because one of the sisters said that no one's ugly and we shouldn't be speaking in those terms. But we've had a slew of dialogue since that thing, and people are arguing one way or the other, or apologising one way or the other. I really don't think the purpose of our discussion is to have side discussions on the chat group about the appropriateness of whether someone finds a particular person attractive or unattractive. So if I could ask us to refrain ourselves from the conversation, either if you're attacking someone or you're trying to defend your position, that's not the purpose of our meeting today, to argue the linguistics of what ugly is or is not. So if I could ask you to please stop. Thank you. If it makes people happy, we can swap the word ugly, which is a synonym of unattractive. If that makes it any easier for you to swallow the harshness or the sharpness of that word. People are unattractive to people. It's a natural phenomenon of human nature. And if you just take a linguistic or a dictionary synonym of unattractive, you end up somewhere along that line finding the word ugly or beautiful. So I think we're getting distracted on the point that I wanted to make on that issue. So, is it still acceptable and still valid in the eyes of God to be married without a religious ceremony? I don't think it is. I think wedding is inherently a religious phenomena. Are two people who just live together, to use a horrible term that some people use, I don't think it's very nice when they say they shack up. Is that an acceptable way of living, for two people to come together and act as though they were married, if I can say it that way, but never go through the ceremony itself? Would they be considered to be married? So depending on what your metric is, your measuring stick, I think you could easily say yes. All that they don't have is a third party giving them a certificate, if you like. Now that certificate can come in various forms, shapes or sizes. In some circles, that certificate would be a piece of metal around your finger. I guess the modern version would be a silicone band around your finger. In other places, it would be a piece of paper that that said you and this other person were married on a certain day. So what I'm suggesting is that when people come together and live together, the only distinguishing feature between that relationship and what we would tend to call marriage is if a third party acknowledges that. And I'm suggesting that third party can, depend on one's perspective, can be either human or divine. So in the situation of Adam and Eve, there are no other people there to be answerable to. So the witness to that, or the third person, is directly God, of course. And if you're an atheist, or you are marrying in revolutionary France in the 18th century, then the witness would be essentially the state. And the only thing I wanted to point out with that was the following. We all know, in fact the vows teach this quite specifically, in order to be baptized, you have to first be converted. The vows actually speak about having fruits of repentance. You're required to exhibit fruits of repentance before you would be allowed to be baptized. I think most of us would find that common sense until you start thinking about it, because baptism is supposed to mark the point when you leave one kingdom and enter into another kingdom. The direction of your life has changed. The change of direction, the change of purpose, is what we call being converted. Just like you do with, if you have an item and you change its use, it's now converted, or you get a convertible. They all give this idea or concept that you have a change of role, a change of purpose. And that's what baptism is supposed to represent. And yet we claim that you're required to be converted before you get baptized. So if you're already converted, what's the point of being baptized? Why do that? So all I want to suggest is the following. Without going into all the intricacies, and partly because I don't even understand all the intricacies, but there is something about being human, intrinsically connected to our humanity, is this idea of rituals. Now, if you go through the Jewish economy and the ceremonial economy that they had, all of that ritual-based society is necessary to maintaining, I'm going to call it religious order, but what I mean by that really is both individually and corporately a connection to God. Without those ceremonies, without those rituals, very quickly religion would deteriorate. So God has implanted within us not only the need for having these rituals, these ceremonies, but when it comes to a corporate experience, we end up creating laws that insist upon this idea that you have to go through a ritual in order for something to be recognized. So you can't just say, well, I was converted last week and therefore I'm in the kingdom of heaven, and I want everybody to acknowledge or recognize it, because we wouldn't. We would say, well, when were you baptized? They would say, well, I'm already converted. Why do I need to go through a ritual? Because after all, everybody knows rituals are foolish, or have this idea of idolatry intertwined in them. Some people might just call it that it's plain childish, superstitious, if you like, to have all these rituals. And yet, even today, we would suggest otherwise, and I think most of us listening to these presentations would agree with that. And so the point I want to make is, even though you were converted before the ceremony, before the ritual, yet your acknowledged entrance into the kingdom of heaven, the oneness with God, is at the point of the ritual. So when it comes to marriage, you can be, if we want to call it that, you can be married, you can be one flesh with that person. You can have been living together for 5 years, for 2 years. You could have bought a home together, shared everything, been completely intimate. And yet people would not consider you to be married until you go through the ritual, through the ceremony. And this is so pervasive in most societies. I'm going to speak about the one that I know the most, that here in the UK, unless you go through that ritual, the government essentially will not recognize you as being one flesh. Even though you live the same way as a married couple, they won't legally recognize that. And therefore all the protections, all the tax benefits, all the benefits that go with marriage, you don't receive until you go through that ritual. Now, it's not for me to argue one way or the other the rights and wrongs of that from a state level, but from a religious level, I've already made the argument. But I'm just highlighting the point that even the state sees the difference between the two. And if you think this is a moot point, an unimportant point, I would beg to differ otherwise, for the following, not for the following reason, but based upon the following evidence. The reason why the issue of same-sex marriage has become such an issue over the past, I'll say 10 years, maybe less, definitely 5 years, across the world, is because everybody recognizes that the state does not afford you the same legal rights, the same legal status if you just live with someone. In many countries, it was not illegal to have a same-sex relationship, but it was illegal to marry, because the state recognized that you have or afforded you legal protection if you were married that it didn't afford you if you were not married. And if you think some of those things are minor points or this is state intervention, I think I would disagree with that. So I think it is important to be afforded these legal protections, these legal rights. For instance, just because you're a child doesn't give you legal rights in certain contexts. But if you're the child of someone, you obviously have parents, your rights with connection to those parents, those adults, are very specific, well defined in law. And those rights are different to what your cousin has in relationship to your parents. So it's not the fact that you're just a child who's 10. It's actually your relationship with other people that is codified in law. And it's based upon this same premise, this same idea upon marriage, which is why people who were homosexual pushed for the right to be legally married, to have the right to marry, which they were not afforded before, even though it was legal for them to have a relationship, to live together. Obviously in bygone ages that wasn't even legal. So once that became legal, it was now legal to be homosexual, the next thing that they demanded for was the right to marry. And it's an important issue, this idea of rituals. I don't think we can escape them. And that's why I think this idea of a religious marriage or religious ceremony is vitally important. Of course, I've not commented upon what the marriage ceremony itself looks like. I think we are in a time of flux. I think there are people who are marrying at this very moment who are trying to grapple with these issues and trying to ensure that their ceremony that they create for themselves is in line with their belief system. And we're not all exactly on the same page on this. People are still learning. So I'm not commenting in this question upon what the ceremony itself would look like. What we're talking about is the rights and wrongs, or the necessity of having the ceremony, and I'm saying that we should. How is a person in a relationship supposed to handle their partner if they have a bad temper? So your partner, your spouse, has a bad temper. How are you supposed to handle them? And the simple answer is carefully. Of course, there's a bit more to it than that. And perhaps we might go to a Bible verse. I'm going to go to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32. Proverbs 16, 32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. So it talks about people who are unable to control their anger, essentially, which is the same context of someone having a bad temper. How are you supposed to behave in a relationship like that? Now, if I can say it this way, people may not think this is factually accurate, but I'm going to state it this way. In our movement, we have come to a place when we speak about equality, which almost all the time is dealing with gender inequality, that we have what people call a zero tolerance policy. Now, you can go on the internet and look up the phrase zero tolerance policy. It's a phrase that's been well used, somewhat misunderstood, I think, or can be understood in different ways. But if you go to various countries who purport to have, arrived into the 21st century and believe in social justice, particularly when it comes to women's rights, they talk about having a zero tolerance policy when it comes to certain crimes or certain issues. For instance, paedophilia or rape or stalking or violent abuse. Depending on the situation, depending on the country, there is this notion that more and more this idea of what people call zero tolerance is becoming the new norm. And I guess we have picked up that phrase and employed it in our own vernacular. And what we have done with that phrase, what we mean by that, or at least what I understand I mean by that, or how I interpret that, is perhaps different to what other people might think. So I want us to hold on to that point. So the other thing is, your spouse has got a bad temper, and it would be okay if they had a bad temper and you could put them in a cage and lock them up until they calm down. You don't have to see them, hear them, and then when they calm down, they could press a button and you could unlock them and you could have a normal life. If you could do that, it would be pretty much okay. But for most of us, we're not able to do that. We're not able to disengage from the effects of that bad temper. So with this idea of zero tolerance policy, I want to introduce another concept or another idea, and people have again picked me up on this point. And have suggested that there may be something wrong in my modelling. And this is the point this is the point that they disagree on. I want to call any kind of bad behaviour, and this one is a bad temper, it's not just even bad behaviour, as abuse. So I've been pretty straight on that. That If someone is behaving towards you in an unacceptable way, this is abuse. So what happens when you do that is you broaden your understanding what abuse is. Some people might argue that you dilute your understanding of what abuse is. So they would see this as something negative. If you call everything abuse, then when you get serious abuse, you might just not think about it much, because even the most minor indiscretion would be labelled as abuse. So I know not everybody sees it in the same way, so I'm only explaining the way I see it. I think it's far healthier to say that any kind of bad behaviour in a relationship is some form of abuse. Just in the same way that if we were going to talk about racism, if we talk about institutional racism, I don't know what people understand that to mean, how they view institutional racism. This may not be a technically correct definition, so please don't pick me up on it and correct me on it. But I want to say it this way: you could have people in an institution who are not racist, but there are rules and regulations that have been put into place which they have to adhere to, and those rules and regulations are themselves racist, and therefore we have what we would call institutional racism, even when it's run by people who are not racist. So that's what I want us sort of to understand institutional racism as. And I'm going to make a big jump from that. There may not be any direct connection. In society, particularly today, particularly this year, I think, especially if we were all living in the United States, in the past you may have been able to get away with saying things or doing things, speaking your mind in a certain way, which today, after all that's happened, particularly the events beginning May 25th, now make some of those things unacceptable. So we have the Black Lives Matter movement to thank for some of that. I'm not saying all of it, and I'm not saying they're the only movement that have changed the way society sees things. But some of the things that even 12 months ago people might get away with saying, it becomes a lot more difficult now to do that. And people are starting to use the word not microaggression but micro-racism. You make these little racist inferences that in the past people may not even have picked up on. The instigator and, if I call it, the victim or the recipient, they may not even either of them realise what was happening. But now, as it's been brought out into the open, people are now being challenged on even what I'm going to just call micro-racism. Some racist sentiment or idea that is so subtle you might not even notice it unless someone picked it up. And of course, people of colour will say they had sensed it or felt it for a long time, but they weren't. Society was not in a place where they could verbalise or speak about it. But we're in a different place now. So the reason why I spoke about that is because if we were to say, let's look at not abuse, but let's look at racism, does it dilute racism or the stigma or the evil of racism by saying racism is a big issue? You know, even those teeny little things at this extreme, not those big ones here. You're not on the street and someone is openly chanting something at you, or if you're a person of colour, you have to wear a certain type of clothing or a logo or a label or something to identify who you are. We're not talking about those extremes. Most society is never there. In the West, it's obviously not there. It's completely illegal to do that. But we're talking about those very small, subtle things that people of colour recognise as being racist, but in the past they would have just tolerated because people would not have understood. They didn't have a voice. There was no platform to express their hurt. And you get to a place when you're the recipient of all of this abuse, where you become desensitized or it becomes normalized. So it doesn't even actually hurt you that much anyway. But we're not at that place today in the world, externally. It's an open topic where people can now express themselves to a degree where people say that we all need to be educated on this issue, and that racism at the very this very extreme, this minor racism also needs to be discussed and addressed, not just the big ones. So if we can take that moral and bring it into the arena of abuse, I just use that compare and contrast to justify, it's not the only justification, but it's the one I wanted to give, of why I want to call all bad behavior abuse. Now, if you're a person of color and you're at work and someone, perhaps your boss, does a micro racist comment or action towards you, you might not be able to prove it. It might be so minor that you might just brush it off. But if you compare that to they stood up and they gave you some expletive, or they openly, in a really horrible way, were racist towards you, you could take legal action against them. So your behavior would depend upon the degree of racism. But it's all racism. So when it comes to abuse, your response to abuse will depend upon the degree or level of abuse. So when we speak about, I'm going to come back to that. So having placed that, hopefully that we can all, I don't want us to agree particularly, hopefully we would, but at least we come to an understanding of how I view these issues, because people have asked me. And then when it comes to the issue of zero tolerance, this is what I want to say about zero tolerance. Is not that you will always take an action. That means you will not tolerate bad behavior or abuse. I don't think it means that, at least not to me. When I think of zero tolerance, what I'm thinking of is that when you take the whole dynamic of abuse from the most extreme to the very subtle and minor, there is nowhere in that range of experiences that we should ignore, that we should be blind to, that we should not, or that we should tolerate. I'm saying we should tolerate none of that, which means we should acknowledge and recognize all of that. That's what I want us to see when I speak. I'm not speaking about other people, I'm speaking about on my own behalf. When I talk about having a zero tolerance, it doesn't mean I take action on every single issue. I'm a person of colour, and many of you listening are, and you know that in any particular week, almost certainly within a particular month, and definitely within a particular year, you will have racism, some kind of racist statement or event that you have gone through. And for most of us, we will do nothing about it. But what we should never do is try to persuade ourselves that that wasn't racist. To say, oh, they had indigestion or they had a bad day. So what we cannot do is excuse it. It doesn't mean we take action against it. And I think that's what I want us to understand when it comes to this issue of what this person has called bad temper, but I'm calling abuse, is that we should have a zero tolerance policy in our movement that would never ignore it. It does not mean we would always take some kind of action against it. That's not what I'm suggesting. So, how does a person in a relationship handle their partner if they have a bad temper? First of all, the best way to handle this is to acknowledge what this bad temper is. Acknowledge it for what it really is. It's abuse. To acknowledge that this is an abusive relationship, that because I'm going to speak on behalf of this person, I'm in an abusive relationship, I should acknowledge that. Now, that acknowledgement may only be to me. I may not even be able to tell the abuser what they're doing, but I need to acknowledge it. So to me, that's the number one starting position about how we handle this issue in our relationship, is to not ignore it. And that's what I want us to understand when I use the word or the idea of zero tolerance, that I will not tolerate such behavior. It does not mean I will do something about it necessarily. It depends what the issue is. It depends what my options are. So, having established that point, I think it becomes critical to understand what the nature of this relationship is. I don't mean, is it marriage or children or your cousin or something. I'm assuming this is, it says partner, so you're married. What I mean by that is, in any 100 marriages, there are 100 different types of marriages. And even though we might argue that both spouses are in the movement, I just use this idea. We might be there in body, but we're not there in spirit. So you may both be bodily in the movement, but it doesn't mean you're both spiritually in the movement. So I think it's very difficult to generalize of how you should deal with this, what actionable things you can do when you're in what I want to call an abusive relationship. The most important one to me is that you acknowledge abuse for what it is. You do not excuse it. You don't say, oh, they had a bad childhood. Oh, he had a hard day at work. Oh, he's not feeling well and he gets like this when he's not well. Or she's depressed and she always goes cranky when she's depressed. All of these things are indicative to me of excusing what we see. So I think we need to be careful in our own mind that we don't excuse these things away and give them another name. So that's point one. And the second point is that we don't pretend that we can actually do something about all forms of abuse. I don't think we can. I don't think we can do things about every form of abuse. Particularly the ones that are on this side, those very small, subtle ones. We can't always do something about every form of abuse. So that's the first thing I want us to acknowledge. I want to read a Spirit of Prophecy quote, which isn't directly answering this question, but I think it's, I quite like this when I think it's quite nice. So this is taken from 19 MR, Manuscript Releases, Volume 19, page 344, paragraph 3. I'll put it on the chat. MR 344, paragraph 3. So, this passage can also be found somewhere else. It's slightly different, but it says pretty much the same thing. It's sort of a cut down version of this, and this is taken from the Bible commentaries. This is 3 BC. I'll put this one down as well. 3 BC, page 1160. The 3 BC, this is the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, and it's a commentary on Proverbs chapter 16. This is the commentary series, and Proverbs chapter 16, and it's dealing with verse 32. It's the verse that we read at the beginning. So I'm not going to read from 3 BC 1160, but I'm going to read from the 19MR one. The 19MR one is quite similar, but I'm just going to say it's a little bit more expanded, if I can say it that way. So this manuscript, 19MR, is actually manuscript number 1411, 1114. And this manuscript is called the Ladder to Heaven. People often call this Peter's Ladder. So these are the various steps of the Christian walk that you go through. I think most of us are familiar with that idea, that concept. So Ellen White says this. She says, "It is easier to act the part of a martyr than to be patient under provocation and to control a bad temper. Sound religious principles must be brought into the life to repress anger rather than inflame it by giving vent to it. We feel very angry, but if we control that anger and are not betrayed into expressions of hasty feeling, we will not lose the respect of our brethren or respect of ourselves. The pattern, Christ Jesus, is our example. Patience is a heavenly attribute, and Christians must cultivate it." So, of course, the problem with this passage that I've just read is that the question was not from the perspective of the abuser, but from the abused. And this passage is actually talking to the abuser. This passage is talking to the person who is exhibiting a bad temper, who basically has become angry. So this is what Ellen White's advice to them is. So what I found interesting here is that she talks a little bit about their experience. And if you can enter into the mind of the abuser, your spouse, maybe the way you respond to it can be more helpful if you understand a little bit about what they're doing and what they're going through. So this is not a psychology lesson to discuss about how they got into this place. So my purpose of bringing this up is not that. So my purpose in doing this is because the person says, how can I handle this person? How can I handle the situation? How do I deal with it? So I think this might help, even just to a small degree. So my main point about answering the question I've already done is that everything is abuse, and just because someone's abusive, it doesn't mean you do something, but you should have a zero tolerance in not excusing it, not labeling it something else. Don't call a bad temper, a stomachache. If he overeats, he gets a stomachache. Because Ellen White speaks about that. She talks about dietary reform so that we don't get into, be grumpy or moody or something. But what I want to say is that we don't make excuses for what is essentially misconduct. She says this: it is easier to act the part of a martyr than to be patient under provocation and to control a bad temper. Now, I want to be careful in this situation. As I said, each relationship is different, but in this context, what's causing this person to have a bad temper is something that they're being provoked about. So someone is provoking this person, and this is why they are having this bad temper, this exhibition of anger. And the reason they're doing this is because they're acting the part of the martyr. So what you might need to understand is when your spouse is abusing you, having this bad temper, why are they doing it? And one of the reasons why people behave badly when they are being challenged, or they feel threatened, or they feel provoked, is they take this place of being a martyr. It says it's easier to act the part of a martyr than to be patient under provocation and to control the bad temper. So you're this martyr, and therefore you're justified in having this bad temper. So if you want to understand why this person is behaving in this way, sometimes they believe that you are the one that has done something to them, and they're the victim, and therefore they are justified in having this bad temper towards you. The next point she brings up: sound religious principle must be brought into the life to repress anger rather to inflame it by giving vent to it. So we spoke about this at the last camp meeting. I can't remember which presentation number it was, but I quoted from someone called, I think his name was C.S. Lewis, and the book was Mere Christianity. And his argument in that book was that, if I put it simply, he said it much more eloquently, much more accurately, that if you behave good, you will become good. If you behave, you will become. He did not say that first you have to be good, the being verb, and therefore then you would do good. You don't be good to do good. You do good and you become good. And this is what Ellen White is saying here. She says it slightly differently, but if you can read the statement or read into it, this is exactly what she says. She says this: sound religious principles must be brought into the life to repress anger rather than to inflame it by giving vent. So, if you vent, which means you let off steam. So, I'm not feeling good, so I'm going to shout. When I shout, which means I give vent to what I'm feeling, what ends up happening is not that I say, oh, like a pressure cooker, I can now calm down. What ends up happening is you end up feeding the flame of anger. It's like if there's a fire here, you're not supposed to open the door or open the window to allow the wind to blow the flames out, because they will just make the flames get bigger. The book was called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Mere Christianity. Mere means only. If someone can just type that on the chat group, Mere Christianity. By the way, I try to avoid often giving references, because whenever a speaker like myself gives references, people think that I'm endorsing that author, which is why often I don't give the references. And when I don't, I know what people end up doing is they end up searching for these documents that I'm referring to, or that I may have glanced through, and I may have read 10% of a document. pick something up and people say, well, that was good, the rest of the other 90% may be good. And I don't endorse materially. If I endorsed it, I would give you the full title. I would recommend it. So this one, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, I wasn't endorsing that. It's someone else had actually posted that reference. So blame that person. We're all going to blame you, okay? It's not me. So what she says is this. If you're not feeling good, don't give expression to your feelings. But if you do, you just inflame it. You don't release pressure. We're not like steam machines that once the pressure builds up, you just open a screw and some steam comes out, and now all the pressure drops. We don't work that way. We work opposite, completely opposite. That is a counterintuitive model. The steam pressure cooker valve, whatever you want to call it, machine. When we give vent, we make it worse. The pressure gets built. The fire becomes raging. What we're supposed to do is repress not just the feelings, but what we're supposed to do is not give expression to them. And the expression of giving those feelings is extremely damaging. So I really like that point. We feel very sorry, but if we control that anger and are not betrayed into expressions of hasty feelings, we will not lose the respect of our brethren or respect for others. So what I want us to remember is most people, when they are abusive, they have within them their bearings. We call it conscience. Most people are conscious of the fact of that they're being abusive, that they're doing wrong. And what happens in those situations is they begin to have a sense that you, the one that they're attacking, no longer respect them. And not only that you don't respect them, but they actually lose respect for themselves. And I think this is a really important principle, because if you react to that and say you're just a worthless person, what you end up doing is reinforcing this idea that they have lost your respect, your admiration, if you like, and it makes it much harder for them to actually be drawn back or won back. And then lastly, the pattern Christ Jesus is our example. Patience is a heavenly attribute and Christians must cultivate it. So if we are provoked into a situation, we're not supposed to let our tempers get the better of ourselves. Now, all of that we just read was from the perspective of the abuser. The question was asked, how do we handle our partners? So I think I've made my position clear on a couple of points. One of them is we should have zero tolerance. Understand it for what it is. It's abuse. It's wrong. Not acceptable. Second, just because it's unacceptable, you have a zero tolerance of acknowledging and recognizing it for what it is. It doesn't mean you will do something about it all the time. It depends what the abuse is. And then, if we could try to, at some level, understand what's going on in the thinking of the abuser, the one with the bad temper, because sometimes there may be in this situation something that has happened to provoke them or cause them to behave like this. Now, the person used bad temper. The person didn't ask if my husband punches me in the face when we get into an argument, because they know that there are degrees of abuse. So this passage that we read from the Spirit of Prophecy is not applicable to what most of us would acknowledge as, clear abuse. If you met your friend and she had a black eye or a bruised arm, and you asked how it happened, and she said often she won't tell you, but you'll guess it's from her husband. You don't go in to say, well, did you provoke him to wrath, do you think? You may have said something to him. We're not talking about those levels of abuse. There's obviously abuse at this level, high level abuse, and there's this subtle abuse that I've spoken about. And depending upon, if this was murder, we would say black eye might be somewhere in the middle. I'm not talking about this kind of thing. The person speaks about a bad temper. A bad temper is not giving your spouse a black eye or breaking their wrists or fracturing their wrist by grabbing hold of them tightly. We're not talking about that kind of bad temper. But you can get into an argument, you can get into a discussion with someone, with your spouse, and they might quickly begin to get angry. And in those situations, you can handle things, I think, in a good way, sometimes in not so good a way, which is why I read that quote. The quote was designed for the abuser, clearly, but we read it from the perspective of the victim, and it did give us some clues about how we might be able to respond in a fight or an argument that was ensuing in our relationship with our partner, on how we might be able to mitigate some of this abuse, some of this bad temper, bad behaviour that's going on. So I'm hoping that helped a little bit. Oh, because everyone's in different time zones. Got a few minutes left, so this will be my last question. Is it advisable for married people to have children now? I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question about is it advisable for people to have children. I don't know what someone means now. I don't know what they think now is, because for some people it was never advisable that they should even marry, let alone have children. And having married and made that huge mistake, it was definitely not advisable for them to have children. Others, they made a success of their marriage, and the obvious step for them would be to have children. It's just the natural progression of the intimacy of their relationship. So, of course, I'm not that naive to not understand what people mean now. They talk about the end of the world. Interestingly, I was mixing with those conservative types. How many years ago was that? Over 20 years ago. And I remember one of those, I was going to say something rude then. I avoided saying something rude. One of those prickly preachers with whom I used to mix, I used to be running those circles, say, what kind of foolishness is this? Is all of this baby making going on? Don't people know that it's the end of the world? And as I say, that was probably 22, 23 years ago. Maybe long time ago anyway. And people have been saying this like now for a long time. I just want to remind you that James White even said the same, and that was 180 years ago, 160 years ago, about 160 years ago, that kind of time. He was saying that back then, don't have children, until he had some children. He even said, "Don't get married." By the way, because we'll probably know that until he met someone, he fell in love with them. By the way, they were platonic friends. Just so that you know, James White and Ellen White, Ellen Gould at the time. They were platonic friends. He was meant to be basically her chaperone, her guardian. From what, by the way, is he chaperoning her from? From all those other men. If you can understand the irony of that. He was meant to protect her, not from coyotes or wolves or something, not from bandits. He was meant to protect her from other men, and he ends up having her himself. And I would argue that they had a platonic relationship that went, depending on your direction, went south really quickly or blossomed really quickly, depending on how you want to view things. So, people have been saying this, don't have children now, for a long time. I want to remind you, this is not even a 160-year-old problem. This is the 2,000-year-old problem. Of course, we mustn't forget that. You go back to Matthew 24, and it's not advisable to have children back then. So this idea of not having children, I think, now is a really problematic subject. And as I say, I don't feel morally nor prophetically qualified to tell people that they should or should not have children. It's always the should not ones, because no one says, "Can you tell me to have children, please?" People don't want to do that. Or they always want me to say, "Tell me not to have children," or "Tell them not to have children," whoever it is. So I certainly don't need to do that. There are some common sense things about having children. Ellen White speaks about this frequently. So it really doesn't do it justice for me to focus on it. But one of the things that she does speak about, two things, perhaps more, depending on how you want to break them down. Make sure you've got money. If you don't have money, I'm going to say this in a really, probably get into trouble. If you don't have money, don't have children. I think that is a fair synopsis of her position. Except, of course, she didn't have money and she had children. So it's easy to give advice and not follow it yourself. But seriously, it makes life really difficult if you do have children and you cannot take care of them financially. Number one. Second thing is, consider your health. I think people don't consider health carefully enough when they talk about either the number of children that they have or the frequency of having children. So that's another thing to consider. And the third point that this I think is connected to this, and I have addressed it numerous times before, is contraception. Some people call it family planning. I don't know why, but there are still people in our movement who get jittery on this subject, and they think it's some kind of sin to sleep with your spouse and deliberately not have a child, to have some kind of contraception to avoid becoming pregnant. They seem to think it's inherently wrong to do that. And the problem with that is it leads you into, I want to call, a really dark area of human relationships, which I think really do become dark and grim, where you end up going into celibacy, isolation, manipulation. I want to call it child abuse, because you end up having children that perhaps you're not ready to have, or perhaps you don't even want to have. And so you end up destroying their lives. So this issue about, would I advise people who are already married to have children now, I'd like to just take the now out of that, because I can go back 2,000 years from there right to now, and depending on where you are, you can always find a dynamic where it's not advisable to have children now. So if I take that out, is it advisable for people to have children? Some people yes, some people no. And I think that becomes a much more useful and pragmatic conversation than the former question as it's phrased about now, because this implies that no one should be having children now. Because if that's the case, because it's a bipolar issue, if no one's allowed to have them now, then what would that mean before? That would mean that everyone should have been having them before. And no one ever asked that, like, should we all have children? I've never been asked that question. I don't know why, but I always get asked the question, should nobody have children? So my point is, if today, and I guess the people are sort of talking about in this dispensation, if no one's allowed to have children, then whenever we went back, whatever that was, I don't know, 1979, 1975, we all should have been having children. Is that what people are going to say? Of course not, because they're going to frame it in that dark and distant dispensation, wherever that was, that it was people's choices. So if it was people's choices then, why it's not people's choices now? I'm hoping that we can all see at least the logic, if not the wisdom, in what I've suggested when it comes to the issue of childbearing and not having children. Simply put, if you can't manage children in your particular situation, it's best not to have them. I think that's just common sense. If your marriage is not where it should be, if your relationship with your spouse is not right, why bring a third party or third person into this broken relationship? Get your lives in order before you introduce something else, another being, another person into this. Often when we have these discussions, and I don't know why, the subject of adoption is very rarely spoken of. People seem to have an aversion to adoption. I'm not sure why. Ellen White recommends in many situations adoption. Her argument is there are so many children who are already here that need to be loved and taken care of. So why not, if you do want children, if you do want to make a difference in the lives of someone, why not try to help someone who's already here? I'm not saying you have to do that, but I do see the wisdom in that. I'm hoping that the rest of us also can see the wisdom in that. So I've answered 4 questions today. The first one was, when you make friends, try not to get too excited. That was the question. And I'm saying, who are we kidding? Because whether you're you or me, and we become friends, if we are attracted to one another, our feelings will get toned up and we'll get excited. We'll enjoy one another's company. I think it's part of the human experience. I think it's necessary. I think it's good. I think it's even healthy. Does it need to be managed? Of course it does need to be managed. I'm not saying that. And I know the question was, what advice can I give to not letting it get out of hand? I don't think that's actually that difficult to let it get out of hand. There are very few cases in the movement today. I know we don't have that many people, but we do have a fair few relationships. Fair few. We might call them courtships. We've had a number of courtships, and there are lots of people, enough people, who have been in the courtship and broken, and they've gone into another courtship, and by the time they get married, maybe they haven't got that far yet, they may have gone through 3 courtships. I don't know. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people who have gone through those courtships haven't gone too far, haven't got so intimate with the person that they've made some really, really grievous mistakes. Most people don't go that far. We all have a level of self-control. But yet, these feelings are still there. And to me, the way I addressed that question was that how do we deal with those feelings? And I'm saying not only can you not avoid them, they're part of human experience. I'm saying they're necessary in order to have a successful marriage. You have 10 friends, you find, I know I don't want to get into an argument on this issue. You find 5 attractive and 5 not attractive. Those 5 that you find attractive, there's one that you might develop a real feeling for. And it's that one person that, if things were to go well, you have an attraction both physically, mentally and spiritually. You become one, you go into a courtship and you get married. I think that's how it should work. I think this blind dates are not a good option. I know people in this chat group, if you can believe it, who actually advocate and recommend that they're good. I personally do not think, I'm not of that party. I guess everybody has their own opinion on the subject. My opinion is I don't think it's a good idea to do blind dates, to enter courtships with people that you don't really know well. Some people think it's good and some people don't. So if you want to court someone, get to know them first. That's my recommendation. Number 2, do you need to have a marriage ceremony? I'm saying yes, you do. Marriage is a parable of a relationship between a human and their creator. And therefore, it's by definition a religious ceremony. No one gets baptized by people in the world because we all recognize this ritual is a divine mandate. What do you do if your spouse has a bad temper? 2 points, 0 tolerance. Everything is abuse. Let's call it for what it is. Point 2, just because you're abused, it doesn't mean you do something about it. Depending on where the abuse is, if it's here or if it's at this scale, if it's really, really bad or if it's minor indiscretion. Gave the example of racism when we addressed that. We should acknowledge it all for what it is, but it doesn't mean we do something about it necessarily. The last question was, if you're married, should we have children now? And what I tried to do is first take away the word now out of that sentence, because I'm not persuaded that it actually makes much sense, because we could have asked a question and I gave 2 discrete examples. I gave the example of James White. I gave the example of Christ. One was 160 years, one was 2,000 years ago. You can show that throughout ages, this idea of the now has been problematic. So I took that out, and then I'm saying, would I advise people to get who are married to have children? I'm saying, sure. If they came to me and they said, can we have children? I'd say, sure, seems okay with me. Other people, I wouldn't say no, but I'd walk them through their options and hopefully let both couples, the ones who want and ones who don't, or who aren't sure, make their own decisions, of course. But there are some people who are not ready to have children. It's a fact. And often they probably were not ready to be married as well. What are the criteria for being prepared for children? I think you need to be able to take care of them. You need to have the material resources. And you need to, above all of that, you need to have a good, stable relationship. If your marriage is not good, Why introduce a third person into a mess? Because they won't fix it. All they'll do is make the mess worse. You have to remember, when you go back to the first question, the reason you got married is because you had these overwhelming feelings about the person, not about the child that isn't even there. We marry because of, if you're a man, you marry because of the woman, not because the child that you don't have, and vice versa. Also mention the fact that I don't know why there's so little talk about adoption. Adoption, I think, is a good option for many people. I would say, thankfully, we now live in a society where adoption can be practiced if you're single. There are many single people who I think would make good parents. And again, in bygone ages, because of stereotypical ideas, it would never be considered that a single person could be a good parent. I think that's been defunct long time ago. And I think many single people are and can become good parents. So they're the 4 questions that we had. I hope it was a blessing to you. As always, I try to spend a little time on these questions. Sometimes they have overlapping concepts or ideas instead of just rushing through them. So we started with a clean board and we ended with one. I'm sorry for that. I know sometimes it can get a bit much just sitting here listening to me without any kind of movement going on. I hope everybody was blessed. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for your kindness and your goodness and your mercy towards us. Lord, please help us to understand our own humanity when it comes to our relationships, when it comes to the relationship of marriage, to the relationship of parent and child. Please help us to be able to understand what these relationships mean to us, what they mean to you, and how we can be benefited by them. Help us never to forget that all these things were given for our benefit. Far too often we look upon many of these things as being curses, that we feel cursed for being married, cursed for having children. Far too many people in slightly different circumstances feel cursed because they're not able to marry, or devastated because they're not able to be fulfilled by having children in their lives. Lord, may we, each of us, embrace the relationships that we have been given, wherever we find ourselves in the cycle of life. Please guide and direct and bless us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.